Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dwayne Peterkin II. I'm a graduating senior communication major hailing from Baltimore, Maryland, the state of which our featured speaker tonight represented in the United States Congress. We are in for a treat tonight as President Hatch will engage in a meaningful conversation with former Congresswoman Donna Edwards about her leadership and life. Now, I want to inform you about the question and answer portion of our program tonight. We will be alternating between questions submitting on Twitter. There will also be 2 mics set up in the audience, and we'll also be taking from questions that were submitted earlier. Also, we would like you all to tweet your questions to hashtag WFU Leads. That's capital WFU, capital LN Leads, all one word. Now, without further ado, we would like to introduce and hand it over to our very own Wake Forest University president, Dr. Nathan Hatch.
Good evening and welcome to the Leadership Project. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We launched this project in 2014 to offer Wake Forest and our broader community the opportunity to learn from exceptional leaders who represent a wide range of paths and worldviews. Tonight, it is our pleasure to introduce an inspiring leader and Wake Forest graduate, Representative Donna Edwards. Representative Edwards was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in a special election in June 2008, becoming the first African-American woman representative from the state of Maryland. She went on to serve 4 full terms, representing Maryland's 4th congressional district until January of this year. As a public servant, Representative Edwards advocated for the disadvantaged and promoted diversity and inclusion in all spheres of society. She led efforts to benefit students in low-income areas, ensuring access to nutritional meals and youth development programs. She also led a movement to invest in historically black colleges and had a particular interest in advancing education in science and technology. Throughout her congressional career, she was in the forefront, working tirelessly to serve her constituents. She championed the rights of women and fiercely fought proposals to cut Social Security and Medicare programs. She was among the first to address the devastating impact of the heroin epidemic in our country, introducing legislation to combat opioid abuse and to reduce overdose. Before her election to Congress, she spent much of her earlier career working on social and political causes. She began as a private practice attorney, clerked for a District of Columbia Superior Court judge, and served as a public interest lawyer. She was also executive director of the Arca Foundation, which actually has a deep Winston-Salem tie. It was the foundation started by Nancy Susan Reynolds. She was born in Yanceyville, North Carolina, earned her Bachelor of Arts degree here in 1980 and a law degree from the New Hampshire Law School. Representative Edwards' career affirms that effective leaders lead by serving, and her strength as a leader has grown with her capacity to identify and address community needs. Whether working in the private sector or the public sphere, she has always been an agent of change, and tonight's leadership project promises to be an inspirational and compelling. Please join me in welcoming Representative Donna Edwards.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Representative Edwards, we are just delighted to have you back at your alma mater.
Thank you. It's actually great to be here, although a lot of changes on campus. That's good. Change is good.
Let me begin by asking you to comment on what you've been doing for the last few weeks, and that is touring America's national parks in an RV. Could you explain why you did that and what you've been learning?
It's something I've actually always wanted to do. And I've gone across country before and hiked and camped and biked and fished. But this is a little bit different. And I came off of a really tough election. It was a, tough November. And I decided I wanted to just go around the country. And so I've been stopping at national parks and national forests and Army Corps of Engineer sites and facilities and camping, but also talking to people all across the country. And it's been an important thing for me to reflect both on my public service, but also what the future looks like. And apart from that, I get to spend a lot of time driving this vehicle and cooking on my 2 burners in my RV.
Very good. Let me ask you about your upbringing. Would you say something about how your childhood and your youth shaped your interests and character?
Well, I grew up in a military family, and my dad was in the Air Force for almost 30 years, and I counted them one time, 14 different schools when I was growing up, all across the country, and I lived internationally. And I think that actually has helped to frame the way I think about our country and the way I think about the world and the way I think about service. My parents were really great role models for public service, both in terms of their volunteer work, but also my dad's real job in the United States Air Force and serving the nation. And so I always felt at some level I would be engaged in public service, and I think that's been true.
Yeah, very good. Could you talk a bit about your time at Wake Forest? You entered in 1976 as one of 6 African-American women in the class of 1980. So say something about what that was like and what you gained here at Wake Forest.
Well, it was a great time and experience. 1976 was the year of our bicentennial. And so our high school class was the bicentennial high school class. And we entered Wake Forest, with the promise of 200 years under our belt and, a lot of challenges. And Wake Forest was a little bit, different. As I've visited around campus, I am just, constantly amazed and surprised in a wonderful way about diversity on the campus, about the number of students of color, about women at every single level in the university's administration and faculty. And so it's a different kind of place, but it's a place that grounded me and has for the last, we don't want to count how many years, but a long time. And it's where I think as a young person, an 18-year-old coming onto campus, I really learned a lot of my activism. I was very active here on campus. And it's also the place that helped me develop myself politically in the way I think about the world.
You never took on the administration, did you?
I did, as a matter of fact. I did. The administration was not always cooperative. But we were able to change a few hearts and minds. And that was a good thing. It was a time, if you think about 1976, it was a time in this nation where there was, some level of volatility. There was volatility politically. Coming out of high school and out of a time where a lot of the implementation for desegregating our public schools framed our growing up period at that time. And Wake Forest was not immune to some of those issues and challenges. And, I was a rabble-rousing 18-year-old, and that turned me into a rabble-rousing 58-year-old.
Did you know when you graduated from college what you wanted to do? Or did you have a clear path in mind?
Okay, don't tell my mom. I had no clue. No, I didn't. I knew I wanted to, work to change the world. I really had that sense. I didn't know how I would do it or contribute to that. My first job out of undergraduate school was at the United Nations, and that was a really great learning and instructive experience, and it helped me continue to think about the world and not just about the United States. That interest continues to this day. It's something that issues that I've been able to work on in the time that I served in the Congress, but I didn't know what I wanted to do, but what I did know is that Wake Forest had given me the grounding and the kind of education that I needed to be an independent thinker, and I used those skills to figure out other things to do. Turned out I could pay my bills eventually.
You worked for a while at the Goddard Space Flight Center?
I did.
What?
So I majored in English here at Wake Forest. Yes, and it was great. After my tenure at the United Nations, I didn't depart the United Nations willingly. It was a time where there were a lot of Americans working for the United Nations, and the idea was we have to bring in some other professionals from other countries, which I think was a really good goal, except that it meant that I was one of the last ones hired, and so I was one of the first ones to go. And so I transitioned into doing technical writing, of all things, at Lockheed Corporation, working at Goddard Space Flight Center. And the reason is because they had all these technical people, hardware and software engineers, programmers, and they couldn't tell you from Adam what they were doing in a way that regular people could understand it. And so my job was to sit with them and talk to them about the work that they were doing, and then to translate that into communicable sentences. Mm-hmm. And so I did, but I learned a lot from it, and I actually was really supported by an engineer there at the time who said, you can do some other things, and they ended up putting me in charge of a whole bunch of hardware and software engineers. I became a systems engineer. They took me, they trained me, and everything, something I never thought that I would be doing. And those guys didn't like it either, because they were like, who's this young black woman in here, telling us what to do? And but eventually it worked out, and I would say that helped me tremendously, because when I came into Congress, I was placed on the Science and Technology Committee, and the ranking Democrat, and at some point interim chairperson of the Space Subcommittee overseeing NASA and all of our science assets. And it turned out that I was the only one on the committee who knew anything about really the work that they did. And so they ended up being good skills after all.
So was it that experience where you first began to see yourself as a leader, given those responsibilities?
It's such a good question. I mean, I don't know if it was so much that, but I knew that I had leadership talent. I knew, don't take this the wrong way, but I liked being in charge of stuff. And I also liked working with and building a team. And I really had to do that at Lockheed in a very uncomfortable environment with, I think all but one of the members of our team, I think there were about 35 of us, all but one, except me, were men. And most of those men were older men, and most of them were older, white, male engineers, hardcore engineers, and trying to convince them that I had the capacity as I think 26 or 27-year-old at the time, to help them realize their greatest capacities was a challenge. But it ended up working out, and so that taught me actually that I had the skills to build a team and to make everybody feel like they were kind of part of our success, and that continues to this day because I still stay in touch with a lot of them.
Yeah, that's great. And from there you went to law school?
I did. Law school in some ways was kind of an accident. I'd always wanted to go to law school, but the timing wasn't right. And what happened is that I was working on a program and a project that was shuttle-based. And the Challenger disaster happened. That shut down all of our programs for quite a long period of time. And I was, at the time, trying to figure out, well, now what do I want to do? And without knowing where the space program was going, I decided at that point to go to law school. And Lockheed was great because they said, well, and when you come out, you can come in and, make sure you do patent law and all of these things. And I went to law school, doggone it, and got interested in doing public interest work and didn't want to see a patent at all. And that's how I actually ended up in the nonprofit sector doing mostly public interest work from that.
This morning you said at one point, I'm an organizer.
Yeah.
And you did a lot of that the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and as executive director of the ARCA Foundation, which is deeply interested in social justice and human rights. Tell us something about that, how you got engaged in those and what you were able to accomplish.
Well, when I was in law school, I volunteered at domestic violence shelters. I volunteered doing protective orders for mostly women who were seeking protective orders from their abusive spouses and partners. And I was really, but I became sort of disheartened by that because it seemed like all we were doing is a whole bunch of protective orders. And I wondered about how you create system change in order to affect many millions of lives instead of just one life at a time with a protective order. And I became interested in the policy work. I worked with a number of women around the country, and we were all kind of volunteers at the time because nobody would pay you to do that work. And started organizing women across the country to call on our lawmakers to make some changes that then resulted in the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994. I was deeply engaged in that work, worked really closely with then Senator Joe Biden, who knew. When I think about the Violence Against Women Act now, it passed in 1994. It's been reauthorized several times. The protections have been expanded. It's made a huge change in the lives of women. It's made a change in the way prosecutors and law enforcement behave, in the way that people see the issue of domestic violence. It's kind of coming out of from behind closed doors, and that was great work, and it involved really pulling together a whole bunch of volunteers and people who cared across the country to make that happen. And I feel like I kind of continued organizing work, only organizing money, when I went to the ARCA Foundation, because for all the good work there is out there, if philanthropy and people who are generous don't support that work, then it just won't get done. And ARCA allowed me to live my passion through the work of other people, and I spent a lot of time leveraging our money, and so we could only give away about $4, $5, $6 million a year, but I would go around to other philanthropists, convincing them to double, triple, quadruple our money. And so we ended up funding a lot of good work by convincing, my working to convince others to support those things. So it was actually, both the work at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, which I started. In fact, we came up with the idea, a group of women on my deck in Fort Washington, to create the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And I was the chair of the board, and we had $1,000 in the bank, $1,000. And they said, well, so now, Donna, will you come and run it? It's like, you only have $1,000 in the bank. But I figured it was enough to pay for childcare for my son for a month. And so I did, and raised more money. And that's how we built the organization. And today it's the largest and longstanding policy organization that works on change at the state and the federal level. And we started out with $1,000 in the bank.
Wow, that's amazing. So what advice would you have for students who are interested in advocacy, in change on important issues, of sort of getting into that field?
Yeah, my advice always is to live your passion. I think, a lot of people will tell you, you can't do this because it doesn't pay whatever it is that people think you should be paid, or it's not going to lead to this particular career path. And, I always say, take those voices out of your head. Just take them out. Take the no voices out of your head and live your passion. And, I had a passion around issues of domestic violence and not a dime. And, when I look back now at the change that can be made if you just pursue your passion and getting other people to help you pursue it, that you can really achieve wonderful things that can make a difference in people's lives. And I think we have, I know when I came out of law school, most of my colleagues went into large firm practice or, corporate practice. And there's nothing wrong with that. But many of them did it because they felt like they had to. They had to do it to pay their student loans. They had to do it to fulfill family responsibilities and a whole bunch of things. And I talked with some of them now, and they, left those jobs, and now they're doing things that they feel really great about. And I wonder, what would have happened if they had started out living their passion from the beginning. And so that's always my advice to, to young people. And since I've been in Congress, I think I shared with you earlier that I visited at least one school a week every week that I was in the Congress. And, middle schools, elementary, high schools, college classrooms, because I think it's important for young people to know that they can be the ones to define their future, that they don't have to wait for someone else to define it for them. And people need to hear that.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So what led you to take the leap of actually running for Congress and to challenge a Democratic incumbent?
So can I say this out loud? I was ticked off. I was very dissatisfied with our representative, and I felt that he wasn't serving us. I felt that he had gotten into office. He was, at that time, a 7-term incumbent, and by about the third or fourth term, he totally had forgotten us. And there were real needs in our congressional district. And I actually spent a fair amount of time going around trying to convince other people who already held elective office to run against him, and none of them would do it. They all said, oh, he can't be beaten. Oh, why would you go up against the Democratic Party machine? It can't be taken down. All of those things. And silly me, after everyone I asked said no, I woke up one morning, it was Good Friday, and I knew I was off that day. And I looked in the mirror, and I literally did look in the mirror, and I said, well, Donna, why don't you run? And Donna answered back, because that's what happens when you look in a mirror. And I went to Annapolis, filled out a couple of pieces of paper, wrote a $100 check, and became a candidate for Congress. I went through the entire Easter weekend, and I did not tell a soul. It turns out...
So that was the Easter with the election.
It was a couple of months away, 3 months. Well, 6 months from then.
Yeah.
But I went in, and I didn't have any money. I did nothing, and I didn't tell anyone. And by Monday, I was like, well, Donna, you at least have to tell your family, because, kind of important for them to know. And so then I did. My family, to be honest with you, thought that I had lost my ever-loving mind. But they were down for me anyway, because your family will do that for you. And then I started having conversations with other people I knew around the district and the community, and it turned out that there was really a groundswell of support to run against this guy. But the mistake that I made was I didn't leave myself enough time, and frankly, I didn't raise enough money. That first race, I think I raised maybe $325,000, which is not enough. Even on a good day to win a congressional race. Sad thing, but that's true. So I ran, though, and I worked really hard. At the end of the day, I actually ended up losing that election by less than 3 percentage points. It was one of the most contested primary races ever, and there was a real issue at the end of the race. I remember that I guess it was a couple of days following that election, and they hadn't decided yet because the votes were still coming in, but I was winning on that day. And then the next day, a truck drives up to the Board of Elections, and it has found ballot boxes in the truck, and the incumbent ended up winning the election. And so it took a lot, but I conceded the election because I just thought it would not be good for, for our voters and for the citizens to contest it. But I conceded, and on that day, in my head, I was already preparing to run against him again. And I did the following election and ended up turning a 2-3% loss into like a 23% win. And so, that was quite a lesson learned, because losing also was a really good lesson for me. I didn't know it at the time, because, when you lose, it doesn't feel like it's a good lesson. But it was, because I learned some things that I needed to do differently. I learned things like I needed to talk about myself more. And I think for women in particular, it's really difficult to talk about and celebrate yourself. And when you're in politics, if you think somebody else is going to come around and tell you how great you are, you're wrong. You have to tell everybody else how great you are. But I did learn a lot from that, and I think that helped me to win overwhelmingly in the following election.
Is campaigning the most grueling thing you've ever done, or actually serving in Congress?
Campaigning is pretty grueling,
Yeah.
but it's fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so much fun. I would go, and especially when I was running for the House, and I'd go out at 5 o'clock in the morning, grab my coffee, and stand at a metro stop or subway and shake every single hand of every single commuter, and do the same thing in the evening, and go to the grocery stores and stand in the parking lot and shake people's hand. And my mother, it turns out, I'm glad I actually never ran against my mother, because she's very good. And she is the one who really had the bug, and she would go anywhere and stop. Do you know, my daughter is running for Congress? And I'd be like, oh my gosh, Mom. But it's pretty grueling, and I especially felt that, frankly, in this Senate race that I just ran last year, and I lost that election, and it was brutal. I mean, I don't even want to sugarcoat it. It was brutal, and people ask me now, well, would you do that again? And I have to pause and think about that. I mean, if there were a reason for me to serve, I'd do it again. But you have to have a really thick skin to do this. I remember my mother driving on the Beltway one time, and there was some radio ad or something that came on saying her daughter was a horrible person, and my mother was having none of it. And she was like, I'm going to call them, I'm going to tell them that what he said was not true and they should not be running that. I said, Mom, you actually can't do that. Let it alone. Or when, my son is 28 years old, and at the time he was just coming out of high school and going to, it was just like nasty. And it's tougher for your family. It was tougher for my family, I think, than it was for me. And so while I'm out there enjoying all of this stuff and given as good as I got, they're upset, and so that's hard to watch.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about your congressional experience. What kind of leader were you? How did you find your skills and ability to be able to be used to get things done among your peers in Congress?
Yeah, when I first came in, I had this idea. I mean, many of us do, especially if you've never served an elective office, about the way things work. And even though I had lobbied, Congress, it had, worked with both the House and the Senate, and, with various presidents, it was so different being on the inside than being on the outside. And I learned early on that individual members of Congress make a determination about what kind of leader they want to be. Do they want to be the one who comes in and who's read the legislation and prepared their questions and, those sort of things? Or do they want to be the person who, shows up at things and shakes some hands and talks to people and is very, sort of personally engaging? And there are different kinds of legislators. And I decided that I'm more a person of substance, and I decided I wanted to be the one who just knew everything. And I found out that there are, a group of members of the House that everybody depends on to know about particular legislation, or when something comes to the floor, what you're voting on, or things, and your colleagues rely on that. And I wanted to be one of those. And so that's what I set out to become. And I think I was successful at that. I was always prepared. I attended all of my hearings and things. I formulated my own questions. I listened to and read the testimony. When bills came up, I actually read them. And this was particularly true for the Affordable Care Act. And we're here on kind of the anniversary of when the Affordable Care Act was introduced and went through. I had the privilege of gaveling in and out the Affordable Care Act. I feel really good about that because I think it was a good thing for us to do for the American people. But it wasn't easy, and I remember that time, the town hall meetings that we were having, very engaging town hall meetings that we were having, and people showing up really just wanting to give you what for. But I had read the legislation. I marked it up. I was a good lawyer, pink and green and yellow highlights, all through the thing. And so when people asked me questions about it, I had the ability to respond to those questions. And so that's the kind of legislator I wanted to be.
Tell us about how you ran town hall meetings, which could be problematic. I think that's interesting.
I love town hall meetings. I do. And especially the ones that we were having around that time. Not everybody loved them, but I did. And so what I would do, I had a rule because I am an organizer, and I was like, well, everybody can come to the town hall meeting. I remember, one in particular that we had where there were, really, thousands of people there. And I set a rule. I said, okay, you can come in, and here's what the rule. Everybody, you can have a minute at the microphone. You can only have 1 minute because on the floor we get 1 minute to say our piece and then we have to be done. I said, you can have a minute, and you can use your minute to yell at me. You can use your minute to yell about the Affordable Care Act, or you can use your minute to ask a question. It's your 1 minute, but you don't get any more. And at my town hall meetings, people came and they took that seriously, and when they tried to violate it, the other people self-policed because they wanted their 1 minute.
Yeah.
And so I actually ended up, one town hall meeting that I ran in particular like that, C-SPAN actually ended up covering it, and then they ran it over and over and over and over again because I was, when people would ask a question, I remember this, one person stood up and had a page, like they had pulled it from the Affordable Care Act. I don't know where they got the page from. And, and they were telling me that something was on this page, and this is why this bill is so horrible. And so I had my bill there that was all marked up, and I opened it up, and I went to the page that they were citing, and I said, it's just not here. This is what's on this page. And it was able to, I think the way that that was done and that I did it, I was able to tamp down some of the craziness that was going on in some of the other districts. And so I don't envy my colleagues, former colleagues now. They've got some big decisions ahead of them, and people feel really strongly about things that they have that might be, taken away or altered, and that they're deeply personal. These, some of the legislation that we work on is not the kind of thing that's abstract. People have a reference point in their lives, and when they want to be heard about it, believe me, and you can affect a change of a member of Congress by making 10 phone calls. If 10 phone calls come into an office on any one subject or other, somebody says, what's going on? And I know in my office, I would keep a log of phone calls, name, address, telephone number, where they were calling from, what they were calling about. And if we got that number of calls, small number like 10, it would make me, turn around and look and say, well, what's going on? And so I can imagine now, because it's more than 10 phone calls that are coming into a lot of those congressional offices.
Let me ask one more political question, and that is...
I love politics, so you can ask more if you want.
So why did you leave a relatively safe congressional seat to do the excruciating job of running for the Senate?
Such a good question. When I came to Congress, I described how I got there, but I had never intended to be in the House of Representatives for more than a decade. not because it's not a great place to be, but I never envisioned myself as, seeing into my latter years in the Congress. And also I came with an idea that there were a set of things that I wanted to accomplish and get those done. And so the Senate seat came open. Senator Barbara Mikulski announced her retirement, and she's the first woman elected on her own to the United States Senate. I thought that that was an important legacy to have in place. In our delegation, Maryland had, when I first started voting in Maryland, we had an equal number of men and women in our House delegation, 4 men and 4 women, and split pretty evenly by party affiliation. Senator Mikulski, her retirement would have only left me, one woman, in our entire delegation. And now that I'm gone as well, Maryland, a relatively progressive state, people say, has no women, not one woman, in our delegation. And I thought that it was a huge mistake to take a Senate seat that had been held by Senator Mikulski and to leave that unchallenged by a woman. And I, as strongly as I felt about that then, that prompted me to run, I feel about that today. And, when you look at the United States Senate, we have, it's basically 20%, 19% women, women of color in the Senate. Now we have more. I think there are 4 women of color in the Senate. But, among Democrats, black women are the strongest, most progressive, most consistent voting bloc of the Democratic Party. And it should not be the case that our voices are not at the table of leadership. That is unacceptable. And so as much as there, as a Democrat, I think there's work that the Republican Party needs to do. I could talk about that work all day long, but that's the Republican Party's work. There's a lot of work that the Democratic Party needs to do to be more representative of the people who elect them to office. And that is, that is a question that is still on the table. And I think it was illustrated so fully in my unsuccessful bid for the United States Senate.
Well, you were very brave to do so. But I'm sure it must be excruciating to go through all that effort. And how do you cope with that? I've always wondered that. Politics is such a binary thing.
Yeah, I got in an RV and I've put 10,000 miles on it driving across the country by myself.
Yeah.
It is. It's brutal. It's a contact sport, but it's important. And these 100 people in the United States Senate have everything to do with our lives every single day. And I feel like, for me, I feel that it is that kind of public service is a calling, and that it's an admirable one. I grew up believing that, and I still do, despite the craziness of the environment, especially now. And I think people of goodwill should be called to public service. I really do. But the process is, I actually felt like I had been in a bar fight after it was over. It was like, somebody take me away. But, with a little bit of, time and distance, I've been able to put that into perspective. It has made me want to redouble my efforts to make sure that that women, and particularly women of color, get to see the fruits of full representation in all of our political bodies at every single level. When our voices are not at the table, it means the voices of our children and grandchildren are not there, of our communities are not there. And I recall that, you know, and I don't have anything against my former colleague who's now the senator, but, you know, I recall somebody saying, well, he's a great feminist. And I'd say, well, that's true, but you cannot tell me that his voice representing the issues and concerns of women of color is on a higher order than my ability to represent those issues and concerns. And it isn't taking anything away from him. Yeah.
Great. We want to open the floor to your questions, so let me turn it back to Dwayne to do that.
We're going to start off by taking questions from the audience. There are 2 mics placed in each of the aisles.
So there are microphones in the aisles.
We'll start over on the left.
Can you tell me about a time when maybe the people around you weren't fully supporting you, but you knew you needed their support? How did you convince them to go with you?
Yes, I mean, you know, with any election, elections are about choices, and so, you know, and I understand that, and I think the job of anybody who wants to represent, whether it's a congressional district or a council district or, you know, a Senate seat, the job is to go out and to convince people to vote for you and to support you. And so, I mean, I feel like I was always good at trying to go out and hear people's concerns. I remember when my district was redrawn after the whatever it was, 2010, after the census, and my district was redrawn, and in Maryland, we're a majority Democratic state, and the Democrats controlled, at the time, the Democrats controlled the legislature and the governor's office. That's not true today. But, so Democrats had the ability to redraw the districts. Well, the Democrats in my state did me the great favor of redrawing my district, so a new part of my district was, I think, 16% Democrat was the new part of the district in exchange for a district that used to be, I don't know, 70-something% Democrat. So it was a really different district. And I said to myself, well, you know what? I'm going to go out and just talk to people and hear from them and find out what they think. And so I went to the Elephant Club several times and, you know, talked to Republicans who were in that part of my district. And we didn't agree about things, but I know that when I left there, people said, well, you know, good for her that she came out to hear us. And then when the election rolled around, I could look at the numbers and the percentage of the vote, and I knew that I got some of them. And that was not about them agreeing with me, but it was about us hearing each other. And I feel like I had a great relationship when I was in the Congress, in particular on some of my committees with my Republican counterparts, where, you know, you read about the things in the headlines are not all of the work of the Congress, and sometimes it can appear that way. And so I worked on a number of issues across the aisle that don't make headlines. They were just like good work to do. So I think our job is to, you know, try to convince people to be where we are, at least to, you know, to hear them out. And then, you know, when an election is over, you know, you got to start getting down to doing some work. That my fear about the environment that we're in right now is that it doesn't feel like the election is over, does it? And I think that's a real challenge for us.
It's good to have Councilwoman Dee Dee Adams from South Bend here.
Good afternoon, Congresswoman, and welcome to Winston-Salem. You've touched on it a little bit, and everyone here will tell you, I have already declared to run for the U.S. House in the 5th District here.
Congratulations to you.
As you said, 7 terms, time to do something different. But in the present environment we're in right now, the bullying mentality that I call it, that a lot of us leaders are being subjected to. We were elected and are elected to represent people, everybody, the people. But we're now in an environment whereas if we don't go along, then we can't get along, and we are chastised about that. How do you feel about that in light of trying to be, again, a public servant / volunteer servant of the people when you are trying to make the world a better place because you feel like that's what you're here for, but we're seeing significant numbers of our leaders now, and for lack of a better word, cowering in the corner because we don't want to make people angry because our constituents feel like we're jeopardizing their lives and their quality of life if we don't go along and get along with the bullying perspective. Thank you.
I mean, it's a big question, and congratulations to you for putting your name out there, because I think that takes, and it just really does take an awful lot of courage. And so I like to think about our system and remind ourselves that conflict is built into the system that we have, and that we cannot be opposed to the conflict of ideas, because our system is designed to enable us to have that out, either through the balance of the branches of government, through the balance of the parties in control or not, through the rules that are set up. And you know what? I like that conflict because it enables us to thrash through some really complicated issues. And sometimes there are voices that, that can win out and win a debate, and other times not. And then there are times when those roles flip. And I think that that's all right. And I know that, we make a lot of the rancor and, the lack of bipartisanship. And I think some of us sometimes are fantasizing about the past because we have always had conflict in our system. I was sharing with Dr. Hardiger, with your class earlier, that I have a favorite thing. I love presidential libraries, and part of my trip, I have visited so many presidential libraries. But one of my favorites is the cartoon room in the Lincoln Library. And I used to think that the media today are vicious. No, no, and no. That was a really vicious media environment. And somehow or other, because of the way our system is set up, we managed to survive all of that. And I think if we could, then we can survive this environment too. And I do think that television and the both amount of media and the kind of media environment we're in makes it more complicated because each one of us is our own media. Each one of us has the ability to have something that's done or other that we record or write that gets circulated internationally. And so it's a complicated media environment, but I don't think that we should confuse ourselves that means that somehow we are more prone to rancor and conflict now than we have been at other times in our 249 years of political history. And I do think that we lose sight of that.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming. So in one of my political science classes here, we've asked the question, what is citizenship? Some writers have said it's things like serving on juries and voting. Other writers have said it's the more ordinary things like, I think you mentioned shaking hands with people at the bus stop or commuters or things like that. So my question is, what is citizenship to you and why is it important?
Well, I think citizenship is actually all of those things. I do think one of the lowest forms of participation is actually voting. I think voting is only the beginning of your exercise of citizenship. And I think one of the mistakes that we've made is suggesting to voters, to the electorate, that the only thing that they need to do is vote. And then if they don't do that, which a lot of people clearly are not doing, that they've somehow abdicated, given up their ability to be good citizens. And so to me, our real work begins not on election day, it begins on the day after election day. And it begins in your community. I started getting involved in my community. I was always doing national public policy work, but I started getting involved in my community because our county was going to put a 4-lane road through our community, which would have divided our community and just been a place where commuters would run up and down the road through our neighborhoods. And I started going to county council meetings. And then I was like, well, this shouldn't happen. So I started talking to the neighborhood associations. And then we found more people who felt just like I did. And then there was a developer who was going to put a big development project on our riverfront and take away our ability to enjoy the riverfront. And we were like, no, 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 no. And so we started organizing against that developer, and then I became our lawyer and spent $1,000 on photocopying and challenged the developer in court, and we ended up winning. They spent like $1 million on their lawyer. I should have been their lawyer. And we won. And as a result, our citizens then had the ability to have an impact and input on what that project was going to be. And so, I mean, citizenship cannot just be about what happens in Congress or in the executive branch. It has to be about what's going on in your, in your local community. And, nobody's too busy, because there's always something to do. And I remember years ago organizing around some of these issues because the county was spending more money on that than it was spending on some of our parks and recreations program. And so I organized all the kids who were participating in Boys and Girls Club to put on their uniforms and go to the council, the county council. And, you can't refuse little kids in their like pee-wee uniforms. And we ended up winning that fight. So I think it's important to be engaged. And I still had a day job. That wasn't my day job. It was just like the extracurricular activities. And all of us can make a decision about what our extracurricular activity can be. And it can just be something that's about your passion. And it can be something that's about your, your communities and your neighborhoods. But it certainly cannot just begin and end on election day with a vote.
Yeah. Very good.
Thank you for coming. My question is about what is the role that those leaders who didn't achieve the goal they wanted or the outcome in an election that they wanted, particularly in the Democratic Party, what role those leaders should have in bettering that Democrat Party for the following elections and for better understanding of the people whom they serve?
Well, so there are probably a huge number of people who will disagree with me about this, but as a Democrat, I really think some of the problems that we have within our party have been covered up by, because there's so many problems in that other party as well. And I think that's covered up some of the issues that we face in our own party in building it and growing it and strengthening it. And I think the work has to be at the local level, that we have to, again, if we ever did, really build a serious pipeline that's more reflective of our voters and the electorate in terms of who holds elective office. And I don't think that that's going to come by just focusing on what happens in 2018 or 2020. This is a long-term project, requires long-term and deep strategy and organizing. And if we only focus on what happens in 2018, will Democrats take back the House? Can they get the Senate? I think we will make a huge mistake. And you know what? The gatekeepers, the people who are deciding who's in and who's out of our party and our leadership, need to get out of the way. and I think you see some of that has happened within the Republican Party is that people, real people who are in communities are tired of these gatekeepers, whether they're Republicans or they're Democrats, controlling the entrance and the locks. And they want their politics back again. And they're rebelling against that in different ways and, seeking solutions. They're tired of the money that controls all of our politics, political decisions, who our elected leaders are, who gets to run for and win political office. And I think that is a universal concern across party lines. And the party that gets that right is going to start winning some elections.
Hello. I'm sure you've been asked this question a lot. It's probably a safe question, but I do want to hear the answer.
Can you lean into the microphone a little
Sorry
bit?
about that.
Thanks.
You hear me? Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now? Is that good? All right.
good.
Sorry. I'm sure you've been asked this question a lot, and just from your terms in office, it was during the entirety of the Obama administration. Could you give an honest evaluation of what you think his legacy will be?
Good question.
Both as president and the things that he advocated for.
So, I think it'll be a mixed legacy. I think it's always hard to determine a person's legacy when they've just left elected office, that it requires some bit of both self-reflection and reflection of the electorate. But I do think, I remember when I started, I actually came in a special election before the president was elected. And the summer that I came in, I remember, people told me when I came in, oh, take your time, get yourself, organized. It's a very, sort of quiet time for you. And then we received a call in the fall to get on the phone with Secretary Paulson, with our leaders, with the White House, to talk about how if we didn't do something in a few days, few weeks, that people wouldn't be able to go to their ATM machines and, get a couple $100 out. And it scared me. It was a very frightening time because I do believe that the economy was on the verge of collapse. And I remember in that time, I was very uncomfortable with doing a bill that said we're going to just give $700 billion without any prescription about how that money was to be spent to people who were responsible for crashing the economy. And, I was a newbie in the Congress at the time, I was like, we can't have this. And the president, I remember before President Obama came into office, he really wanted the legislation passed, and so he was making phone calls with President Bush and the Bush administration to members of Congress who were recalcitrant, and apparently I was one of those. And so I got a call from President Obama saying, or then Senator Obama saying, I really need you to do this for me. I'm going to, I will, win this election. I'm going to come in, and I'm going to be the one who gets to decide how those resources, how that $700 billion is going to flow through the economy so that we can recover the economy. And I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt of, being able to do that. And so when it came up the second time, I ended up voting for that legislation. And I have to tell you, I think one of the legacies is going to be that although our economy clearly from the stimulus package that was passed, from the bailout that was done, clearly our economy recovered. He had, consistent job growth over the entire course of his presidency. But that money and the way that it was spent didn't help people who had lost their homes and didn't, I think, effectively enough punish the people who took them. And I think that's going to be part of the legacy, an economic recovery to be sure, but very problematic. And I think we are seeing the residual of people feeling that their personal economy did not improve through that, even though the overall economy did. And so the winners were a lot of a small group of people who already had, but the losers were, people like, my friend Carolyn and her family in Topeka, Kansas, and, people who lost their jobs, but the job that they got back, even though they got a job back, didn't pay them the kind of money that allowed them to effectively take care of themselves and their family. But I also think that there will be a story written about a stimulus package that indeed stimulated the economy, even if it didn't do everything. And certainly I think the Affordable Care Act. I mean, the reality is the Affordable Care Act has enabled millions of people to have health care who didn't otherwise. And I'll close up this point by, saying in my travels, I've been talking to lots of people, from various, walks of life. And, one young woman or not so young, she's probably my age, woman, I like to think of myself as young, that I talked to from, who's in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And she works at one of the salons there, and she makes minimum wage. And her, she voted for the president because she really wanted change and because she was sick of how things were going. But she and her husband both receive insurance for $300 a month, and they are heavily subsidized under the Affordable Care Act. And before then, and she told me, they didn't have insurance at all because her husband has a heart condition and they couldn't get insured. He has a significant pre-existing condition. And now she has health coverage. And when I asked her, well, why did you vote for the guy who said he was going to take that away? And she said, because I didn't think he meant it. And I think there are a lot of people like that, but I think one of the pieces of President Obama's legacy, if it survives this week, is going to be the Affordable Care Act. And I think that would be, a good thing. And, but I think it's a mixed bag on the international front. It's a very, very mixed bag. I mean, none of us can say that we're happy with where Syria is right now. On the other hand, I personally believe that the Iran nuclear deal was a good deal, and especially under the circumstances. And so I think it's a mixed bag internationally and domestically, but how different a mixed bag is that for any president who's served, and especially, one who's served 2 terms.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We'll take turn to one of our questions from the board. One of our students wants to know, how do you define success, and how does that look in your career?
How do I mean, to me, success is about, about how you feel you've done personally. I mean, I don't think, I don't think it's defined by, for example, pieces of legislation passed and things like that, but what have you done? And, one of the very first things that I did during that lazy summer when I first came into Congress, I had been visiting a lot of schools, and I saw kids who were hungry. And I had Maryland added to something called the After School Suppers Program. And all it means is that poor kids get breakfast, lunch, and dinner at school so that when they come to school, they come prepared to learn. And I know that today there are thousands and thousands and thousands of meals that have been served to children in Maryland schools because of what I did. And it hasn't never made a single headline. People hardly even know the program existed. But for me, that is a success because I know that kids aren't going hungry. And there are, sort of other things like that. And I've loved my various careers because I think we're also in an environment where young people, you're going to have several careers. You're not going to have one career. And I've had this career in elective office, which I cannot be more humbled to have been able to serve in the United States House of Representatives. When I was a kid, my dad and mom used to take us over to the Capitol to picnic on the west front of the Capitol lawn. Never did I think that that would be a place that I could call my workplace. We would run up and down the stairs on the east front and look at the Supreme Court and at the old Library of Congress. And so I feel really privileged to have been able to serve. There are not a lot of women who've ever served. There are not a lot of people who've ever, I think 10,000 or something, who've ever served in the Congress. Certainly not a lot of black women who've served. And it's humbling, but it's not the last thing that I'm going to do. So my favorite writer, poet is Maya Angelou. Guess that, right? And still, I rise. So that's the way I view service.
Okay, we'll turn.
I think that's a wonderful place to conclude.
Oh, that's a shame. These people are
Okay,
standing.
okay, we
No.
can, yeah.
Anybody who's standing at the microphone.
Okay.
How about that?
Okay.
That's my rule.
Terrific.
And I'll try not to be long-winded.
Thank you. Pertaining specifically to your travels, like as of recent to the national and state parks, what do you think is, well, I guess beyond potential federal government cuts, the biggest challenge to us as an American people in engaging and continuing access to these park systems, and specifically pertaining to communities that are underprivileged and communities of color?
Yeah, such a great question, because one of the reasons that I wanted to go out on this trip was also to come back and tell the story of, the experience of our national parks, because one of the things that I have noticed in our parks, and I've been to, I think, 15 of them now, and I've been camping in them and hiking in them, and all across the country. I went from Florida across the country to California, Joshua Tree, and and the rest, the Utah parks and everything. And total, I have seen 5 black people. Total. Yes.
That's why I asked.
That's a problem. And the reason that it's a problem is because our country is becoming more diverse and not less. And it's important for all of our communities to own and embrace the parks, because if that doesn't happen, then they will be more subject to the cuts and the lack of service, because no one will feel like they are part of the parks. And so I am absolutely committed. In fact, one of the great benefits of being a member of Congress is, even though I can't lobby for a year, I still have friends who are members who are appropriators on the Interior Committee. And so I'm going to talk to them also about what some of the parks lack. One of the things that I've seen in the parks too is that you can see the impact of climate change on our parks. You can see what happens when some of our species, whether they are plant or animal species, are diminishing and disappearing on our parks. But we have to get all of our communities owning and embracing the parks. And I think the Park Service, National Park Service, has done a better job in telling the diverse history that surrounds our parks, telling the history of First Nations, whose lands were taken for some of our parks, telling the history of African American, Latinas, and Latinos around our various parks. And I think that's a good idea, because you have to be able to see yourself in something in order to take ownership of it and want to protect it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So my question pertains to the Affordable Care Act. So I remember the past 8 years before this election cycle, Democrats, we spent a lot of time calling the GOP the party of no, because they simply refuse to help, or they refuse to put out a different plan. I now know why, because they don't have one. But what amendments or proposals do you think the Democrats could put out now to improve the Affordable Care Act to try and ease some of like the problems that are in it, so that we don't end up becoming the party of no?
Well, there are some, I mean, actually, there are some things that both Democrats and Republicans recognize as a problem. And I think one of the challenges has been, and I know during the time that I was in, because I did have the opportunity to vote against 65 attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I think it's 65, it could be more, the Affordable Care Act. But for example, there's a Cadillac tax that applies to employer-provided health care plans that are really generous, especially those, for example, that are achieved through collective bargaining. We know that's a problem. Republicans know that's a problem, and we could fix that if that's what we were fixing. There are some issues that are related to affordability where we need to, expand the marketplaces. We also know that the states that refuse the Medicaid expansion actually have exacerbated the problem that we're facing right now, and there could be agreement around that, which would then open up the marketplaces. So, I mean, we've identified, and some of these things have been identified over a long period of time, but if the opponents are just, no and repeal the whole thing, then that's a non-starter for us. And I think it should be. And it turns out that it's a non-starter for the American people because they would not be reacting like this. So it does remind me, when I worked on the Affordable Care Act, I went back and read the debate around Social Security when Social Security was first proposed. And actually, if you read that debate, it almost mirrors, sometimes to the word, the debates that we are having around the Affordable Care Act. But since the time of the passage of the Social Security Act, I think it's been amended 9 or 10 times, fixed, improved, expanded. And and that was done on a bipartisan basis. And so it's going to take that kind of work if people are serious about making this a health care law that really does work for people. And so those ideas are there, and the Republicans know what they are because we've had the conversation before. But right now, I don't know. My last message that I got, I was looking for my iPhone, but the last message that I had, of course, is that they are not going to be voting tomorrow, and that members are being asked to stay through the weekend, which means a lot of arms are being twisted right now, and it's not really clear to me whether 21 of them, those arms can be twisted, but we know how to fix this thing. And there has to be the political will to want to do that and not just living up to some campaign slogan about repeal and replace.
First of all, thank you for coming, and thank you for your service. My name is Alexander Holt, and the question I have for you today is returning to the conflict that you spoke of earlier. You said that it's a permanent role of change and of policy in the United States government. As a leader, how do you go about facilitating the constructive conflict in an environment that seems to perpetuate destructive conflict?
It's a good question. I mean, I'll share with you a story that I shared with some others earlier. I was sitting as a member of our space subcommittee, and our charge was to reauthorize NASA. Now, you would think that that should not be something that would generate partisan conflict, but it turned out that it did. And so on our committee, the Republicans came up with one bill, the Democrats, I led them, we came up with another one. We voted for ours, they voted for theirs, and all of it just died. And so after that happened, I picked up the phone, I called my colleague from Mississippi, Steve Palazzo, we're good friends, And I said, we should be able to figure this out. He's a Republican from Mississippi. We don't probably have anything else in common, but he's a good guy. And I called him. We had coffee. We pulled out a napkin. We, wrote down the things that were the most concerning to us. We got our staff together. We didn't tell anybody because when you tell people things, sometimes in Washington, that can be like the beginning of the end. And we worked out an authorization that we could agree on. And we took it to our committee chairperson and ranking Democrat, and they said, wow. And they brought it before the committee, we voted for it, not a single no vote. Took it to the floor, not a single no vote. It passed, and then it died in the Senate. But I share that example with you because I don't think it's a singular example. I think there are many examples that don't always make the headlines where people do exactly that. And again, I think sometimes conflict is for a reason because there are serious policy disagreements that have to be resolved in the process, and that is not a bad thing because people will make choices. Where it's destructive is then the unwillingness to say, okay, we have this conflict, where are the areas where we can seek some agreement? I laid that out a little bit in response to the Affordable Care Act, where we know and our Republican counterparts know what some of the real problems are with the Affordable Care Act without destroying it. And so we've got to, get beyond the headlines and the noise and the campaign slogans to do that. Generally, it's kind of the responsibility of a president to call us to that common calling, and so I'm waiting for that.
Thank you.
I can't ask a second question, right? That's not out of bounds.
How about you ask me offline?
Sorry, I don't have a Twitter handle, so I can't.
Oh, I do have a Twitter handle. Me?
I said
First?
I don't. So.
Yeah.
No, I mean, just when we finish, come up to me, ask me your question.
Yeah.
But before I do, I apologize. Maybe I was perhaps I forgot to say something during my first question. Just thank you for being here. It's a great.
Oh, thank you all.
Yeah.
I should have said that straight up first. I just forgot.
That's all right.
But
Thank you all.
Donna Edwards, we are so grateful for your life of commitment, of service, of vision, of effectiveness. Thank you for living out Wake Forest's motto, Pro Humanitate. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that was fun.
Thank you for coming, and have a good night.
That was fun.
That's great.